Welcome to Might in Motion, where we help you navigate your personal and professional goals to manifest them into your deserved career and life path. Here at Might in Motion, we don't make excuses, we do the work and go above and beyond. The Might in Motion podcast brings you guests that will help stretch you out of your comfort zone and push you to improve your goals. Like, comment, and share. This is Might in Motion. I am thrilled tonight to bring to you Kara Duncan. She is an author, she's a speaker, she is a mom, and she's a friend. Kara passionately advocates for couples who have experienced infertility, loss of a child, and or adoption. She helps lead an infertility and loss support group and also volunteers at pregnancy resource centers. She speaks and teaches frequently on issues of infertility, adoption, and loss to women's groups, always pointing her listeners to a loving, faithful God who can heal the deepest hurt. Her and her husband live just outside of Atlanta with their daughter. I am so thrilled to have you here tonight. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, we are blessed because we have become connected through our two little girls who are in the same class. And I just have really, really loved getting to know you and your husband's story of how she came into your life. And you've written a fantastic book about it. I have it here. I've got it like by little earmarks and everything. But before we dive into that, can you tell us a little bit about you and just maybe a little bit, then we can kind of get into your story of how all of this came about of adopting your wonderful little girl.
Sure. Well, first of all, I do love how we're connected and how sweet our daughters are together. A little bit about myself, as you said, an author, speaker. This is something that I'm very passionate about, just because I know how hard our journey was. I know from that experience, it can be very lonely and isolating, and I don't want others to experience that. I want them to know that they're not alone, that there's others that can relate to their story, and that there's a lot that can be learned in the wait, too. So the book, to your point, summarizes our journey. It took us 7 years to form our family. So from the time that we officially decided, yes, we're ready, let's start the family, until the time that Olivia was in our lives, it took 7 years. And there was so many ups and downs, a lot of trial and error at points with trying to do through the medical side of obtaining a pregnancy, and then having to close that door and then grieve that and learn more than about the adoption process and going through that journey with its own unique sets of ups and downs. But I'll say that I've grown personally, but I can also say that I've grown professionally in that manner as well.
Well, I mean, you're probably set at a little bit of an advantage because you are an HR expert.
Sure.
And so, most of the HR folks that I've worked with always have just kind of this calming nature and thoughtfulness about people and about teams. And, as I read your book, there were moments when you showed so much gratitude towards the teams you worked with and the grace they afforded you of, hey, I got to drop everything and I got to leave because this adoption, might go through. I got to drop, I got to go, or we just got our baby, and
right.
I think a lot of times for individuals that are in leadership roles, it's important to really have a relationship with their associates so that they know what's, hey, what's going on? Why is there this maybe higher level of emotion that's completely warranted, right?
Sure.
Can you kind of share a little bit of what are some things that you think, especially new leaders that maybe have never, dealt with anything like this, how they can show grace to their teams and people that might be going through something similar?
Sure. I think there's several points that I'd make on that. One is I think if we can just relate as leaders and managers to the fact that others just as you probably experience yourself, have their own trials and their own challenges. And hopefully, you, as a manager and leader, have been afforded that same grace and flexibility. And that's your chance to pay that forward to your team. Um, I would also hope that managers and leaders would try to understand and see that this is just part and parcel to life and us being human. As much as we wish we could go out and hire somebody and they be an expert in a certain field and that's all they do and that's all you have to worry about, that's just not what we get. We get people as full packages with full lives. And many of us don't hold up our hands and say, "Could you please give me a trial or a challenge?" 'Cause on top of working full time, I would love to try to balance this thing too. Um, but if you can try to see the silver lining in it, that oftentimes our trials and our challenges, although they are very difficult, during and after, there are some areas that they grow, and they're only going to bring that back to their workplace, that those areas of growth that they wouldn't have otherwise maybe grown in. Um, and I think it's also just an opportunity to understand, that challenges, like I said, are gonna happen to all of us, so just, give grace to that. I think you'll find that when you give grace and you give that flexibility, it almost increases exponentially the amount of, loyalty that they have to you as a leader and a manager, but also to the organization. When they're looking back at their journey to say, "Wow, that was a rough patch that I entered, but they were really there for me."
Yeah.
All the more that they're gonna wanna stay and contribute even further.
And it's not just a manager associate relationship, it's peer to peer as well.
Mhm.
Um, you know, Even on my team, about a week or so ago, we had an associate, and his baby girl had to go to the hospital.
Mm.
And unfortunately, they were there for 7 days, right? And
Mm.
obviously not planned. It was an emergency, and the whole
Sure.
team just rallied.
Mhm.
I met with him today, and he was like, what I loved is that every time anybody reached out to me, it wasn't about work. Every single person
Mm.
was just, how are you doing? What can we do to help you? How's your baby girl doing? And, you don't always see that. But when you create a team with that dynamic, it becomes like this ride or die team, right? Like
Yes,
everybody's going to
yes.
go all in for everybody. And it's so cool to see that you can turn something that others might take as a negative, and there's a way to twist it into a positive.
Yes, yes, and to your point now, it seems to be almost the culture of your team now, that
Hmm.
that's what they'll do for each other, and isn't that what we all need?
Yeah.
Because I think especially as professionals, we have a tendency to believe that, "Well, this is what I've signed up to do, this is my job, it's my responsibility, it's not supposed to be on their shoulders to pick up any of my slack during the season." And although that is a good attitude to have,
Hmm.
I think it's also an important exercise for all of us to, even for those that are going through a challenge, to learn to let go a little bit, and to let the team catch you, and that's okay.
Yeah. Now, when I read the book, I laughed and I cried while
Oh,
reading the book,
sure.
which is just, it's amazing, an amazing read. It's called Love Always Wins. Highly recommended. I got a lot of people that I know just love picking up a good book. And this is definitely one of them. I will say, I was blessed. I didn't have to go through a lot of the stuff that you and your husband had to go through.
Mhm,
Um, but I know so many women that have, either through a loss of a pregnancy or
mhm.
going through the adoption process, which unfortunately is not an easy process to go through.
Right, right.
Um, can you share a little bit more with the audience of how your faith really helped you and your husband through this process that was 7 years long,
Mhm.
with some pretty big ups and downs?
Very much so. I would say first to the audience that I know that we all have some sort of faith in some regard, right? And so we all have some sort of a starting point, but it's often when we do enter into these seasons of a trial or a challenge that it's tested,
Mhm.
and it's either going to take further root or it's going to shift and change, or maybe a little bit of both. But for me, when we started to enter really thick into that season of infertility, it was the first time in my life that my faith really came to a test to say, what do I do with all of this? Right? am I even allowed in some ways to approach God and
Mhm.
just be angry and be depressed and frustrated that this isn't happening? Am I allowed to do that? And to kind of tiptoe into that area and say, okay, I think so. Like the more that I read his word and dig into this, it seems like that's what he values. He values our hearts and he wants to know our hearts. And that's what was in it at the time. So I laid it out before him. So that was extremely helpful. But then also, just as I continued on that journey, there were just so many different folds and aspects of my faith that kept coming to light. Um, and pretty far into the journey, one of those aspects was this issue of trust of, okay, who's really in the driver's seat here? For myself personally, I'm very type A. So if you give me a goal, um, whether you even tell me or not, I'm going to map out a way to get to that goal and I'm going to take all the appropriate steps to get there. And so in my mind, both when we went through infertility and adoption, I felt like I was in the driver's seat because I was
Mhm.
ticking all the boxes and doing all the things. And when it was month after month and year after year that our family wasn't formed, I began to realize I'm really not in control. I like to think that I am, but it was a moment to then kind of again come back to God's word and try to understand, okay, so who are you, right? You're sovereign. That's what I learned. You're
Mhm.
sovereign and you can be trusted even when I don't know the answers, when I can't see the future, when I don't even know if I will become a mother, because that's something I really grappled with too. I could go on and on, as you know, there's a lot in the book, but I think one other aspect that I'd highlight there when it comes to faith is I started to also understand and realize in my journey that I was placing a lot of value and my identity in the fact of becoming a mother
Mhm.
because I wanted that. And I started to realize that that was a really rocky foundation to be on because each month, if I didn't, then it was kind of this not only disappointment of the fact that a pregnancy didn't occur, but a continued disappointment of why can't I grasp a hold of this identity that I so badly want?
Yeah.
And through that journey, from a faith perspective, it was an opportunity where God really had to recenter me and almost completely shift me to say, okay, stop thinking about your identity rooted in this. Your identity, first and foremost, is rooted in who I am. And
Mhm.
based on that, that's who you are. I am a daughter of the King. I am loved. I'm valued. I'm chosen. I'm cherished. All these beautiful things that create a foundation that never shifts or changes because God never shifts or changes. And what a beautiful thing then to be able to continue on the journey, although I did have to come back and remind myself frequently frequently about those that that's who I am.
Yeah.
And so regardless of whether or not I actually end up getting to be a mom, I'm okay either way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's so many different aspects in everybody's life, right? Where we as individuals like to hold on to things.
Mhm,
And being able to break free from what we think our identity is,
mhm.
just it frees us up for so much more, right?
Yes.
And that could be something as huge as becoming a mother or a father. It could be something to another individual, like pursuing a particular title, or
Mhm.
oh, I thought I was going to be in the military my whole life, and now I'm
Right.
not, or
Right.
whatever the case may be, right? And being able to break free from expectations we put on ourselves
Mhm. Right.
can be really, really hard to do.
Mhm.
And but when you do, you're opening up a lot of doors for positive things to happen in your life.
Very much so. And to your point, even from a professional standpoint, I think we often do that. We
Yeah.
can look at certain points in our life and say, well, professionally, I thought I'd be here by now, or I thought I'd have this title, or I thought I'd be part of this type of an organization, or I thought I'd have these credentials. I mean, fill in
Mhm.
the blank, right? But if we can learn to be a little bit more open-minded to the fact of, well, what's your foundation? And what is your expectation? And is that even a fair expectation to put on yourself? Because oftentimes, to your point, it's all self-created.
Yeah.
It's nothing that our faith has defined or somebody else has defined for us. It's ourselves doing that, and it's worth revisiting and thinking about.
Some other things that you talked about, and we've talked on this podcast in the past, was around boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think we think a lot about boundaries between, spouses or, your parents and things like that. But, even just boundaries around relationships with people that you work with,
Mm-hmm.
and creating that space for yourself where it's okay for you to hold that boundary, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to say you have one. It's another thing to actually enforce it, right?
Sure.
How were you able to identify that, hey, this is a boundary that needs to be enforced?
From a professional standpoint,
Yeah.
it was tricky for me. I think to your point, because of my profession of HR, I was so used to allowing myself to enter into other people's worlds and their
Mhm.
pain and their hurt and providing some sort of an avenue for support that they felt comfortable with. But I had a really hard time flipping that and allowing myself to receive the care and support and even just letting people in because it just often sometimes in the HR profession, it just feels like I'm here to take care of you, but nobody asks me how I'm doing, right? That's going to be up to my friends and family, nobody at work. But I found that over time, by not sharing, I felt like it was becoming a barrier. And it
Mhm.
was almost like a boundary within myself that I had to tear down to say, it's okay to let this boundary down a little bit for those that I know need to know and would benefit from knowing. Um, and even just becoming creative in that process to say, with that, when I kind of removed that a little bit more and allowed people into my world to know, hey, this is what I'm struggling with, this is what I'm going through, this is kind of the current challenge that we're facing. There was a point in our journey that became so incredibly painful to talk about
Mhm.
that I didn't want to put that wall back up, so to speak, that I so cautiously took down. And so I got creative and created a blog so that way, in that incredibly painful moment, I could at least give them an update and keep that connection open. But I wouldn't have to revisit and retell the story 16 different times, so to
Right.
speak. And that was very helpful. And I think they found that beneficial too of, she's continuing to still open up and share. And I still get to follow her journey, but at least I know where she's at. And sometimes it just meant that they would come into the office and give me a hug and walk away. And they knew that that was enough. It was just an unspoken at that point.
Well, I think it allowed you to continue to be your fully authentic self.
Yes.
And, when we start putting up too many walls, everybody notices,
Hmm.
right? And they
Yep.
notice that if you are too walled off, it's like, well, who is that person? What are they really?
Right.
You know?
Right.
Yeah. Now, through this journey, you and your husband, tried to make sure you carved out uh, time for fun
Hmm.
and time to stay connected,
Yes.
which can be very challenging for any couple, but even
Sure.
more challenging when you've got this 7-year kind of journey that has like enveloped your life.
Hmm.
um, any tips or tricks for those people out there that are like, man, I may not be going through something as as arduous as what you guys had to go through, but I'm still not feeling that connection with my spouse on like,
Sure.
hey, here's some things that you guys did to keep it, I don't know, alive.
Sure. Sure. I would say a couple things. Keep it regular. So agree and commit together on what frequency that should look like
Mhm.
and just be flexible. I think sometimes to your point about expectations, we look at others and think, "Oh, but if they're doing a date night every week or, they're going on trips once a month, we should be doing the same thing." That may not work for you right there in that season, and that's okay. But just agree on a frequency and a minimum, at least, so to speak, of this is what we'll do to date each other regularly. Um, and maybe even talk through some of those details. Does that mean that that needs to be phones off, phones down?
Mhm.
Does that need to be something that's, screen time, non-screen time, meaning going to the movies or not? Because sometimes the point of it is to truly connect and build the relationship. And so if you find that you're doing some activities that aren't allowing for that connection, it may not help as much as you would hope. The other piece that I would offer is whomever it is in the relationship that's more prone to take the lead, just let them. Because once more, to your point about expectations, I think sometimes we tend to have an expectation or even a desire that one spouse or the other be the one that leads it. Don't put that kind of pressure on it. Make it easy. If one person's stronger in that area, just let them go for it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think maybe even opening the discussion to understand what's what's a goal, in addition to keeping something regular, what's kind of a big goal that you might have been missing or need to re-engage with? Because I can reflect in our journey, and one of the goals they would really deprived ourselves of was any sort of dating or connection that costed any type of money.
Hmm.
And understandably so, we were in a season where we were stashing away any extra money into our adoption fund because it is very expensive, and we wanted to do as much as we could to save up for that. But then through that process, we had looked back and realized it has been years since we've left town and had a vacation together. And so because of that realization and us both agreeing, yes, this probably isn't healthy. We should probably see what we can do to correct this. We agreed to say, yes, we're going to take a trip this year. We'll still save everything that we can, but it's okay to carve out a little bit to ensure that we get those memories and that connection, because it's so important at any season, but especially if you're going through something together. You don't want to just look back at the end of the year or the 2 years and say, wow, it's just been a lot of grinding it out, hasn't it?
Yeah.
You want to be able to look back and say, wow, we really had a fun trip. We created some really good memories.
Yeah. Sometimes it's just that doing something together, right? And you can be creative in that. Like, you can be creative with like how expensive things are or how
Mhm.
not expensive, right? I'd say one of my favorite date nights that my husband and I did was we went to an arcade and
Oh,
we
no.
just played video games and, like, had arcade food, right? Which is
Sure, sure,
disgusting, right? But I mean, it was really fun.
sure.
And you're kind of connecting in a different way. And so try to be creative regardless of where you are, financially,
Mhm.
but having that time carved out is so critical if you're in a long-term relationship of any sort, right?
Right,
Like,
right.
you have to be able to remain connected. Now, you had to go through, this adoption process of all the approvals and everything. I mean, background checks, and oh my goodness, it's
Mhm.
it's ridiculous. But you had to do it not just in one state, but multiple states because of
Mhm.
moving and all that. What advice do you have for people that are maybe starting that adoption journey, so that they can prepare themselves for, it's almost like another full-time job from the way you've described it.
It really is, yeah. Several things. I think if you can find anybody in your community or through your connections that have adopted, um, make those connections. Meet up for coffee, meet up for a meal, whatever it takes. But sometimes having somebody who's been down that path, that you can just sit literally across the table from and see their face and hear about their journey really helps, because in some ways they're giving you all of their tips and tricks of here's what we wish we would have done, or here's the things that we did that really helped. Because to your point, there are so many facets that they look at from an adoption perspective, and some of it can be surprising and shocking. And so to be able to hear from them is really helpful. I know we had that for our journey, and that proved to be invaluable.
Yeah.
The other piece I would consider is try to look at it through the lens of a birth mother. So it's really easy to sit on one side, so to speak, and think, I'm sorry, you want to know what? You need to know my financials. You want to know how I grew up. You want to know how I plan to do any discipline. You want to know my employment records. You want my fingerprints, like all the things. You want my physical. I could go on, right? There's so many layers that they look into. But again, try to think of it through the lens of a birth mother of she is the one that's choosing life for her child. She's the one that's carrying this pregnancy to term. She's going through the labor. This is a plan that she's being intentional to create. She is choosing the parents that she wants to raise this child with. And so that's a big deal, right? We're not just talking about an exchange of a vehicle or something
Right.
more mute. This is a life, and she should have the assurance to know that this agency that she's working with has done their due diligence to ensure that I can assure you that we've looked into the details of their lives, and we would feel confident and comfortable if you were to choose them to parent. I know that's not always easy to do, but I personally, especially to your point, when I came to the third round of doing a homestay, I'm like, oh, I just don't want to do this again.
Yeah.
But I had to remember and remind myself, this is crucial. This is a really big deal for her. And I want her to be able to have that assurance that she would be able to choose confidently.
Yeah, which is really special. And I didn't realize that there were different types of adoptions
Mhm.
either. So more kind of open versus closed. And can you maybe define for the audience what some of those different types mean?
Sure. There's I guess you consider three main categories. There's closed adoption, semi-open, and open. So a closed adoption is when the birth mother makes her adoption plan and chooses not to have any contact with the adoptive parents for a variety of reasons, and that's okay. There is the semi open adoption, and that's where there's an agreed upon communication between the adoptive mom and the adoptive parents. Um, but it's not as exposed, I guess you could say. It
Hmm.
might be that the adoptive parents send quarterly updates with maybe a letter and some pictures to the agency, and the agency then passes it to the birth mother. So that way, there's not even an exchange of contact information. Um, but there's a frequency that's met upon there. An open adoption, I would say there's even a range within that, but generally speaking, an open adoption is where maybe there is an exchange of contact information and there is a set upon agreement of to say this is what we'll agree on. Maybe we'll be friends on social media, and any updates that we have on our end or any cute things that happen, we're going to post pictures there, or we're going to set up a shared photo album through our apps, or we're just going to text them to you, or maybe we'll even meet up in person at an agreed upon frequency. There's definitely pros and cons to either of those options, but it's beneficial to be able to see it through first and foremost the lens of the adoptee.
Yeah.
Because if you see it from that perspective, then you're going to try to evaluate and choose something that you feel would most benefit the child. And there are so many research studies that have been done on this, but recent research really does point to it is healthy, if possible, to have semi open, if not open, because it's nice, as you can imagine, from an adoptee perspective, to not only know growing up that that's part of your story, but to have the details of that story.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it's human nature in our minds to fill in the gaps. If we don't know, we're going to have to imagine. And sometimes that can take you down some pretty unhealthy paths, right? You might imagine something that becomes more glamorous than it actually ever is or was, or it could end up to be something pretty negative, and you might gain some negative biases or perceptions about something that may not even have been the case.
Yeah. No, that's so true. And it's interesting, you and your husband actually could have changed your perspective on which type of adoption you wanted to do throughout that
Yes,
process, and
yes,
being able to make those assessments and have that grace with yourself and with each other on, hey, we're okay with making this change.
yes,
It
very much so.
is really, really cool to
Yeah,
see.
to your point, I recall early into our journey, I really just thought, "Oh gosh, I just cannot imagine the concept of sharing and being so open. We're gonna choose closed," and that was my vote. Um, and then learning more through the adoption agency and learning more through books that I had read, you started to not only understand conceptually, so to speak, of the benefit of it, but you really started to see the heart behind it to
Mhm.
realize, wow, um, you were in some ways taking two very broken pieces of a woman who can't conceive and a woman who can, but needs to choose someone to parent her child, and replacing them together. I think I would want to love on her in some way, right?
Yeah.
And have some sort of an openness and a connection to her so that we would always have that connection in our lives to say, "Wow, look at this child that you bore. Like, she's amazing." And vice
Yeah.
versa. Like, she enjoys the benefit of seeing how the child's growing and how they're being raised and developing so well. So I think it can be very helpful to try to keep an open mind and look at all the different aspects
Yeah.
that are available.
So we're kind of coming to the end of our time together this evening. So I'm really curious how you're going to answer this question, but if you can go back and talk to yourself 10 years ago, what advice would you give yourself?
I think for me, it would be to have a little more patience within myself. Um, as I mentioned, am very goal driven. And because of that, I want to get to the goal very quickly versus learning to pause and enjoy the journey and being okay in the wait. Um, I've grown because of my journey, and I can look back and say that I did it, but it felt forced, if that makes sense. Versus, I think if I could have, to your point, had a chance to even talk to myself then, I could have just told myself, be a little more patient. Look at these milestones and enjoy them while they're here. Celebrate these little milestones, even if it's not the big win, so to speak. You didn't reach the big goal. Sometimes it's these little marginal steps that we take that are worth celebrating. And I hope that that's something that I carry with me to this day, of just learning to enjoy the journey and to not pass up the small things and think that they're small, because in essence, it's all these small things that really add up to our life and what
Yeah.
we do.
Yeah. I love that. Be okay with the wait. Man, that's yes. I need to like put that on a I don't know, frame it and put it on my wall, I think.
Right, right. I do too. I still need to remember that, but it's really important.
It's gonna be a post-it note, I think, on my mirror, because it's true. Like in any aspect of your life, we have to, like, if you can actually have that self-patience, man, how much better would life be?
Yes, yes. And to your point, I remember there was a season in my journey where I had printed a quote that said, waiting is working.
Oh, I
Because
love
to me, it wasn't working, but I had to remember, like, sometimes
it.
waiting is still working, and
Yes.
that's okay.
Yeah, it is. So I want to share with everybody how they can reach you, follow you, learn more about your book. What are some of the best ways for people to connect with you?
My website, on the landing page, there's a link to the book. So if you scroll down, you'll see it there. It's on Amazon. And then I'm on pretty much all the social channels, Facebook, Instagram. I'm new to it, but I'm learning with TikTok. So any of those is great. I'd be happy to connect and hear more from your audience.
Do you have the same handle on all of them? So is it Duncan Kara at basically all of your different social media platforms, or?
Yes. Well, Facebook will be Kara Duncan. And then TikTok, I think it was shortened to DUNC.
Okay, awesome.
Kara DUNC. Yep.
All right. But KARA-DUNCAN.com. All the links of the book, you can get access it there, as well as Amazon. The book, once again, Love Always Wins. I highly recommend it. Fantastic read about their journey with infertility, adoption, and their relationship and faith with God. So thank you again for joining us tonight. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I've had so much fun.
Thank you for tuning into Might in Motion. If you learned something about motivation, momentum, mindfulness, or might, please like, comment, and share. Thank you.